Okay, we are recording. Thank
Yay!
you so much for joining me today, Ivona. This is a very new experience, so
Yes.
we'll have to work this out together. So I know that you have achieved and you've done a lot since we last spoke, and I think we spoke about 2 years ago in person.
Yeah.
When was
Yeah.
the
In
last time I saw
person.
you?
Yeah.
Yeah. um, and since then, you've moved overseas, you've done lots of study and travel. And just to contextualize where we met,
Mhm.
do you want to explain the story if you
I
remember?
mean, we met at Peter Mac. I think it was really nice because I remember when they were hiring like another research assistant. I remember putting it, I think I put it on like the Biomed Student Society. I'm not sure if you reached out through there, but it was really exciting. So they got someone that was like roughly my age in the lab. So that was fun. Um,
Yeah,
and yeah, I
exactly.
think like it was the very first day, your very first day, I think we met. So you were
Yeah,
very young, very young. We were both very young then.
bright-eyed, bushy-tailed.
Exactly.
Yeah, so that's interesting because so for everyone watching, I'm actually calling from the Peter Mac. So it's a nice full circle that we've come.
Nice to be there
Actually
virtually.
working today. Sorry.
Nice to be there virtually. I
Yeah.
missed it. Nice environment.
I guess in hindsight you can say that, but I remember when you were doing your honors, it was another
Yeah.
story.
It was very stressful, but it was fine. We did good things.
Yeah,
We learned to manage our stress.
yeah, exactly. So I want to get into that, but first, we are both in Melbourne. You're at your family home at the moment.
Mm-hmm.
Um, wow, what a weird time we are in at the moment. I feel like Melbourne's just gone through this really intense lockdown, and stage 4 restrictions are now finally easing. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and I guess we're crawling out of this lockdown period into this world, into a very different world, I guess, and we're learning what this new playing field is.
Mm-hmm.
How have you found it? How have you found this year and this lockdown in Melbourne?
Yeah, so like we were kind of chatting about before, I think one of the hardest things for me is like when I have a lot of time, I start to kind of like panic. I like to have my days like very filled with things and I like to kind of be out of the house as much as I can. So initially I thought it was really difficult also because I've been in a slightly longer lockdown. So I came 2 weeks before Melbourne went into lockdown. So I was like kind of like one of the last flights out that didn't have to actually go through hotel quarantine, but I was quarantining at home. So I hadn't left my house for 2 weeks. And then after that, I had the full Melbourne lockdown, kind of got out of it. And then the second wave. So now we're back.
Yeah,
But it was initially really difficult for me, particularly because obviously I was overseas and I had different plans and it kind of impeded how my research project went. So it's kind of now gone on a more like, I guess, like, it was more of like a literature review kind of statistical analysis thing, which I guess has happened for lots of people in their honors, masters, PhDs as well. I think that's, a bit disappointing. So I was really upset at the start, particularly because I was just about to go and get started in the lab. But with that being said, I think I coped with it pretty well. I exercised a lot. So it was hard for me not playing basketball or anything like that. And like, I would just like go for runs, go for walks. I took up meditation, which is something that I've never done before. It was really, really good. And a little bit of yoga. And yeah, I think it was just like spending time with my family. I think being overseas, I definitely miss them a lot. I'm really close with them. So being able to sit, stay at home, yeah, really help. Other than that, I was just trying to keep busy and I had a thesis to do. So I really had like I didn't have a lot of time on my hands when you take into consideration how much work I had to do with that as well. So it was just filling in the spaces.
yeah, for sure. So just to contextualize a bit more, do you want to mention what you were doing overseas before you had to
Yeah.
rush back?
Yeah. So I was completing a Master of Pharmacology at the University of Oxford. So it's a 1-year program that's like an intensive master's essentially. So you kind of start in late September, early October, and you just go through all the way till the end of middle of September now. And it's honestly, if anyone is ever thinking of applying a master's program like that, it is actually fantastic because you get so much done in a year. You meet so many people from everywhere. And I think that's one of the things that I really appreciated from it. It was just that I completed a Bachelor of Biomedicine before, so just like you at the University of Melbourne, and I did an honours year as well. And you're very kind of, it's a different experience because I had friends purely that were either doing biomed or science. And like, although I had a couple of friends doing comm, it was very rare for me to interact with people who weren't thinking the same way I was thinking, right?
In Melbourne or at
Um,
Oxford?
Sorry?
In Melbourne or at Oxford? Do
In
you know?
Melbourne. So a lot of my friends were either like biomed or science. I had a couple of friends in commerce, a couple of friends, you know, from high school that were doing other things as well. But in general, a lot of them thought the same way that I thought about science. And then when I went overseas, my master's program, everyone was from like different, you know, undergraduate degrees. We had people doing biochemistry, chemistry, engineering. We had someone who, I'm pretty sure they were doing like something like psychology related, right? So it was coming from, although most of them were predominantly sciences, they were different types of sciences with different ways of like kind of problem solving, thinking about certain things. So my interaction with them and how they tackled certain problems, I think really kind of enhanced my learning experience there. And also because you live on a college, you end up like two of my really good friends that I met there, I met on like the first orientation day thing. One of them was doing like Jewish studies and the other one was doing film studies, and just having that perspective on problems and having that conversation with people, I think was something that was really enriching. Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. Did you feel like you gained any particular skill set from those different interactions in particular, or was it just like a
Yeah.
general kind of eye-opening, like seeing all these different perspectives and I guess learning from it, I guess more passively?
Yeah. I think like, so when I think interacting with people from different like kind of cultural backgrounds as well. So a lot of them, like lots of international students were there, right? So it wasn't like it was just people who, especially for the masters and PhDs, everyone was kind of coming from different places. So I think what I learned from it was not only the fact that yes, there were people from different, kind of study or areas of specialization. So there were people, I guess, that were doing different things from me, but also people who were thinking about different ways for the same problems that I was doing. So when we would have, so the way that my course was set up was that the first year we had like an introduction to pharmacology, which is like a massively sped up thing. There's like lots of content. I've never had to deal with so much content in my life. That was something that was really overwhelming. And when I mean a reading list, I mean you need to do the reading list because your professors know you by name, which is something that I had never had before other than in my honours year, which was something that was a little bit challenging and, you know, quite different to get used to because you know them all and they pick you out in the class and they can ask you questions and they're not afraid to pick you out of the class and ask you questions. So when you first approach them, you have a lot of coursework, lots of reading lists. And when they say over there, a term that they used to use a lot was like you're reading for pharmacology, not you're studying pharmacology, because essentially the reading lists are just ridiculous, like absolutely ridiculous, and you need to do them. So when I was doing that, the first part of the course was a lot of problem solving, so lots of like worksheets, things like that, lots of labs that you had to go through as well. I did like quantitative pharmacology, which is essentially like the maths like behind pharmacology, and a lot of that is lots of problem solving as well. So that required lots of interaction and seeing how different people tackle different problems. People do maths differently in different parts of the world, which is I think something that people forget about as well. So it was working in a group and learning how people approach those problems was honestly the best thing that I took from the course, because then you look at things in different ways and you view like different problems. After we had the first semester, we have the second semester where you learn like 6 different topics and you pick, I guess, 2 specializations. So mine were cardiovascular pharmacology, which is what I did my thesis on, and also so I also did neuropharmacology as well. But it just, you know, it depends which ones you picked, like, and which specializations you liked. But yeah, it was really good. And I think at that point then it halted because my thesis wasn't able to like transition into the lab because of corona. But then yeah, so that's how the course is set up. And I think when you have like in reflection, a lot of it is just like learning with different people in groups trying to solve problems. So then when you have those people from different backgrounds and those interactions that you have, they're so important for, you know, learning how to look at things in different ways.
Yeah, for sure. And I guess you were going from that environment that was so stimulating and having so many different perspectives and people to talk to and people to meet, to then being kind of ripped from that prematurely and having to come home so suddenly and be, I guess, regress in a sense to living with your family and being isolated and seeing people who you used to, I guess, hang out with, and just getting back into the older patterns that you had while you were living here. What was that transition like just having all of that newness and novelty to then having isolation and a lot more quiet?
Yeah, I think initially I was really upset. I felt, I feel like everyone was. I think when Corona started, I think there was a period of grieving for everybody because everything was ruined for everybody. Like not just for me, like my sister plays basketball at a high level, and seeing how her season was ripped away from her was something that, it's hard. Everyone went through it. So I felt kind of silly, I guess, about, feeling guilty because I was safe. I was lucky enough to be able to get a flight back home, to have somewhere to go to as well. Because a lot of the people, like there were people in my course who were actually from China. One of them was actually from Wuhan, and he couldn't go back. So it's things like that you kind of, when you put them in perspective, you can't really take it for, I didn't take it for granted. I was like, you know what, it's okay, we're going back. I shouldn't be angry about the way that I'm feeling, but I guess it's okay to also grieve because, you have lost something, but don't get stuck on it. So I think for me, the whole thing, initially the first 2 weeks was I was upset, but I kept having this kind of thing in my head being like, okay, well, you don't know when this is going to be over, hopefully be over soon, but you've got stuff to do and you've got a plan. So I kept trying to think like we need to keep moving forward so that way I don't get stuck in being upset about, this being ripped away from me. And also because realistically speaking, I think because the way that my master's program works over the summer period, it would have just been me and my, like anyone who's doing extended masters in college. So the whole college environment would have already been, completely disrupted. So I was trying to think of positives, even though they were very few, just to kind of get me through. But yeah, I was upset, and it was, it was difficult for me initially, but I think after that, once I threw myself into my thesis, it was fine. So yeah.
For sure. And yeah, you had just achieved something incredible, which was to get accepted into Oxford, to travel to the other side of the world and start studying. How, I guess, so you mentioned, you sat with the grief for a little while and really acknowledged that, and had 2 weeks of just, I guess, being with it and not pushing it away, which is completely, it sounds like a really healthy coping mechanism for something so turbulent as a pandemic. And then you moved straight on to, like having an action plan and getting your thesis done and starting to really speed things up again. Were there any other tools that you used? You mentioned meditation and yoga, other skills that you had to kind of learn to cope with that change upon coming in?
I think it's just like making conscious decisions. I think like for me, I've always exercised a lot. So for me, exercise is something that really helps me. It calms me down. And even like when I was doing my honors, there was a really stressful period in my time as well, which I think you were definitely a part of, and you saw me at that point. And it was a difficult time because I had like a lot on, and there were other things I was doing on top of my honors as well, like with the papers and things like that. I'm not sure if you remember, but there was a lot of pressure on me at that time, and I still maintained it. But I think what I learned from that is that you have to make it a conscious decision. So I made it like something that I had to like sit down and be like, okay, this is what I'm doing now, I'm going to exercise. I think the only other thing was like I tried to, initially it was really hard for me to talk to people because I used to get kind of like, I got this massive FOMO being like, okay, well, we're all stuck in our houses. Like, I don't really want to talk to you because this is kind of different from how I would normally socialize. So I was really withdrawn. But then afterwards I made an effort to, contact friends, it was different because obviously you're through Zoom now, and there's something that's lost, I guess, through the internet. Like when you're sitting here and you're having a conversation, like I'm talking to you now, and I know that I'm talking to you, but it doesn't feel like I'm talking to you. It feels like I'm talking to my computer. So I think that initially was, very difficult to kind of adjust to, but it's fine. And that was like one thing that I had to kind of learn and, grasp quite quickly.
Yeah, totally. I completely agree. Communication has become so distant and fragmented, I guess, and we've just had to completely change the way we think about talking to other people and relating to other people, and it's becoming really hard to connect in a really meaningful way. That I mean, that's my personal experience. Have your classes continued online, or was it wasn't really coursework by the point that you left, right? It was more just head down.
We still had like we still had like certain bits that were like coursework, and it was really funny because my supervisor, like our course coordinator, bless her heart, she used to like try to find the best time for all of us. So there's a person who, like one of my classmates, like he lives in Peru, and then there was me, and then these are really different, like drastic time zones that she's working with, right? So her having to kind of sit down and kind of work out what the best time was, I I feel for her. That would have been a task and a half. So the fact that she did that was amazing. But there were a couple of times I remember, like, I started working, I'd call my supervisors, I'd start around 6. Like, they were really accommodating, especially because my supervisors, they're actually Australian, which is really good. So they knew kind of like, well, they worked with my time zone. And so they would have it in the morning. So I would kind of start my day here. Like, I would be working by myself, doing my readings and everything. And then around 6 or 7, I'd have like meetings with my supervisors, sometimes meetings with our course director. We lost like other things as well. I think the kind of like good thing, I guess, about Oxford is the fact that you have lots of mentors as well, which is something that we didn't have at Melbourne Uni. And it was, it's because it's a very different environment, I guess. So like, I think when you look at Melbourne, like, I used to go in and I would study, then I would come back out. But because university in Australia is so different, you don't live there, right? Like, it's somewhere that you go to learn and you come back, you go back home. Whereas over there, everything's connected with the university. And typically, like, my sport was like, I played varsity, so I played basketball through the university. All my activities, all the clubs and the societies I joined, all my friends, everything was within that. So it's such a small little bubble, so that you have lots of mentors and things like that. So I lost that, I guess, in the aspect that I wouldn't meet with my mentors as often as I would, or it'd be via email, that kind of thing. And then you also lose like the college environment, because I think you learn a lot from the professors who are part of your college as well, and the people there and the interactions you have. I was like, joined the Oxford Union, which isn't like a union, it's like a debating society.
Yep.
And I used to love to go to the talks there, because you're exposed to so many different people, so many successful people who have accomplished like amazing feats in life, and just listening to them and learning from them is something that like I would enjoy doing like on a weekly kind of basis, and have the opportunity to. And that was also kind of ripped from me as well. So it was a bit difficult, but I think like other than that, the rest of my kind of communications and classes and everything like that, and my mentors with my supervisors, in regards to my supervisors and my like course coordinator, they maintained, but it was shifted until like so nighttime.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, it's so jarring having that loss of all the kind of the things that are peripheral to learning, but they all kind of inform and contextualize and prop up what you do learn formally in those formal classes and coursework, into everyday interactions, and your ability to synthesize what you've learned and explain it to someone else, and having those informal just conversations and interactions in that environment. And I guess, to use the buzzword, networking and things like that, are just elements of academia and learning that are so important. And I personally, I didn't realize how important they were until suddenly learning and education has become so formal that it's all like, it's almost too intentional. It's all those accidental meetings and encounters that happen around that just become I guess such a rich experience when you're in an environment like that.
No, I completely agree. And I think like the reason like with your channel, like why this is so good is the fact that like you're actually opening people's eyes to see how many different pathways they are. Because I think everyone starts off university so naive. And when you go and you have a look at how many different ways science can take you, people forget about them. People are too scared to go down them as well. Like sometimes I think, you have to look at, without sounding a bit like cliche, like you have to kind of look at your university degree as like building blocks, and you can pick and choose what you add to it. And then the different parts that you have to it will guide you down a different career that you're more specialized in than other people. And then these career paths open for you, but people aren't aware of them because we have such a rigid way of thinking about science. We think of like, okay, I did like my undergraduate degree. And like, I've also fallen kind of prey to this because I thought there was only 1 or 2 ways you could go, until I saw how many different options like science can kind of guide you from. And that only comes when you talk to people. Like I think, talking to our supervisors at Peter Mac was one of those things that really opened my eyes, and was the reason why I applied for this master's. Like if I hadn't met them, and if I wasn't in this lab group and having this conversation with these people that they were guiding me and really like cared about my future, I don't think I would have actually ever applied for this master's. So it's really important.
Yeah. Has there been a way to supplement that in any way with like your online learning, or has it just been completely erased from your interactions? Do you know what I mean?
I mean, like, Yeah, no, I know. I guess like it's difficult because I guess we still have these conversations. I think my supervisors are fantastic. So like we still talk, and hopefully once I get my grades back soon, we'll have another conversation. And it's really important because they've also kind of guided me as like different options I can take as well. And they've just been really supportive. And even like our course coordinator here, because it's such a small course, there's only 20 people in my, I think 18 now, maybe, yeah, so 20 to 18 people in like my cohort. It's very, very small, and like everyone knows everyone. It's very personal. So I think that's like the one thing that's really great, because you can have these conversations and they can like see like, okay, well, these are your strengths, these are your weaknesses, because they know you, they see your reports. And like this is something that we didn't have, but I used to get report cards, which was for me like crazy. I was like, wow, I'm like in university, I'm getting report cards. And it got to the point where I was like, I want to show my parents, like I'm proud of this. Like let me show my parents, because like typically I think through your undergraduate degree, you never got like, you got scores, but you would never get a report card with someone being like, she's doing really well, or like this is going really good. So they know you really well, and I think they look at what you're good at, what you're not as good at, and like they can kind of guide you in that direction. I think that's something that I really appreciate, and something that they've still managed to do, because like you still get that contact with them over Zoom, I guess, but it is better when you're in person, because I did obviously lose a couple of like those interactions, like the mixes and things like that, where you would get to talk to people in different parts of life.
Yeah, it sounds, I mean, from the perspective of doing all of my university so far in an Australian university at Melbourne Uni, it feels so foreign to hear about a system where it's much smaller and more, there's more continuity, I guess. I think in our courses, just the way, it's nothing against necessarily a particular university or a particular model, but I guess it's just a systemic way of thinking about education, how it feels so didactic, and then also the feedback that you get is didactic. There's no conversation that happens between the teacher and the pupil as what you're describing.
Yeah, I think that's also just like the way that like any Australian universities view. Like to be honest, like when I look back at like my undergraduate degree, I think Melbourne was like fantastic. It's a fantastic university, and they really do like get the most out of their students. And like it's something that I think like in your honors year, I think like in my honors year, that was the point where I realized like I was in the right place at the right time, because I was speaking to my supervisors and they were really like guiding me, and the amount of support I had from the university. But I think that just typically comes from research degrees. So when you're in an undergraduate degree where you're having like lectures and you're in a massive cohort of students, I looked at like the undergraduates at Oxford as well. They have exactly the same experience. It's the fact that once you go into like a research degree, like an honors or a master's or a PhD, like that's when you have people who get to know you really, really well, because there's not many of you typically. And then also on top of that, you have supervisors who are there to kind of, interact with you day to day. And like, I think that's really important. And, I think that's why sometimes I think that an honors year needs to be kind of like mandatory. I know this sounds like probably horrible to any undergraduate that's probably going to watch this and be like, I do not want to do an honors year. I think you should all do it. Like, it's my honest opinion, because I think you get so much experience from it. And if you want your career to go in any sort of like kind of research path, even further down the line, you have so many opportunities. You could write a paper, you could, be involved in extra research. You could be helping PhD students and learning from them as well. I learned so much from the PhD students in our lab. Octavio, I learned a lot from. So yeah, it's really, really good.
Yeah, absolutely. And talking about just how being in that smaller group and learning from the people around you opens your eyes to all the different pathways that there are within the sciences. Have you been able to distinguish or distill whether there are pathways in academia and in research that is not purely like sitting at the lab doing the pipetting or, writing up reports? Like, is there more?
There's so many options. Many options. I think like it just depends. Like, I don't know. It depends what your interests are. And I think personally, so some of my friends went into consulting for like pharmaceutical companies. Others have gone into like big pharma in like terms of like the research and development, which I guess is also kind of like pipetting, but also strategizing. So they're kind of like planning where, the research is going to go, which is really important. I remember a former student actually had a medical degree already, and he's gone into advising for big pharma companies, where he will actually like kind of sit down and being like, okay, this is what I'm seeing in the hospital. This is what I know is lacking in drug development, because he does have a master of pharmacology. And like, I think this this is where we should go. So they're the kind of things that there are lots of other kind of options as well. I think with technology and the way that technology is kind of like exploding and like I don't think people realize like how like it's not limited anymore. I think any sort of science at the moment, there are so many new avenues that will keep popping up, especially like the further down the track you go. The way that technology is like, I don't know if you've like noticed this, but you know, there's like Apple watches and fitness watches and things like that.
Yeah.
The way that they're impacting how we like first of all learn about our body, our determinants for our health and things like that. That is behavioral data. Like, but what do they do with that behavioral data? Like someone needs to analyze that, right? And then like they can do population studies on that. Like these are things that people could, you know, be using and novel fields that can be coming from it. But at the moment, we're still kind of in that transition where everyone's firstly learning how to use technology and that kind of thing. And, you know, I saw that you were learning how to code as well, which I thought was really, really cool.
Oh, yeah. It was just a very
I think
Python thing though.
no, I started learning as well, like, and it's really difficult. I think it's something that's really important and a skill that lots of other international students have that I learned while I was over there. And I think having those kind of skills alongside a science degree as well, or having like a science degree with like a different type of background can lead you into so many other things. There's also, I know that like scientists that have gone on to do a law degree and then have ended up going into like, you know, patents and things like that. Like there's all sorts of directions that you can go with a science degree. And I think we are always limited to thinking that, you know, you have to be a pet monkey, but it's not, you don't have to. And there are so many different things. And, you know, to some people that's also interesting. I think I like being in the lab and working in the lab, but at the same time, I like to sit and analyze things. So it's a bit, you know.
Yeah.
But yeah, so many options.
Yeah, I just got a message. Is that popping up on your screen?
No, I can't see anything.
Okay, good. So where were we? We're talking about, okay, so yeah, how do you see, this is a really big question and I don't expect you to come up with a solution for all of our world problems, but so you mentioned that tech is moving into just this explosive kind of state of building new industries that we haven't even conceived of yet. What do you predict? What direction do you predict we're going to go in now, given the whole COVID situation and how research and science is being funded at the moment? Where do you think tech will fit into all of that?
Yeah, I'm really angry with how research is being funded at the moment.
Tell me about it.
Yeah, no, I think I'm going to start with that first, but I think it's just because, if anything, I think the way that we've dealt with like COVID, like in general, in terms of research, is firstly, the funding has just been thrown, right? But it's been thrown in such a way that there is so many people working on vaccines, so many people were doing like ridiculous like trials and like all sorts of therapeutics and things like that. There needs to be, in my opinion, a very kind of pragmatic approach about how you direct your funding. We don't need 20 labs around the world working on the same thing. You know what I mean? Like, I think funding in medicine and in research is so limited. It has to be, you know, directed to the right people, and without so many people doing it. Yes, maybe 1 or 2 lab groups can be doing it. That way you have, you know, your replicates to see if it's working within like different labs and different environments. But I think in general, seeing how many people are working on a vaccine, how many people are working all on like different, you know, therapeutics, especially the same ones, trials of the same ones, I think it's a little bit, you know, it could be wasting money, particularly when we don't have as much. So I think that is a little bit concerning. But I think in terms of like what's happened with COVID now is like, I'm a really big believer like prophylactic treatment. I don't think anyone should get sick. I think it's really important to kind of stop it in the first place, make sure that no one gets sick. Don't treat them when they're, you know, completely, you know, when it's like at that point, sometimes, you know, there's not much you can do once someone already has the disease, particularly for like neurodegenerative diseases and things like that. And for me, I think it's going to be interesting because like you can probably talk more to this. However, I think if you look at how many people, I remember in Australia, there was a stat, like something like there was a 70% decline in like specialists who were like oncologists who were viewing like patients, something like that. So imagine how many people are going to be coming up now with like more advanced stages of cancer, perhaps even other sorts of like, you know, kind of chronic diseases at a later stage. And I think people will be dying more of heart attacks and things like that. So I think our medical system in general is going to be completely overwhelmed in the coming years. And I think what technology now can do is like, yes, we're still learning. I think we're not 100% with it, right? So I think a lot of scientists, particularly like older generations, they have a hard time kind of swaying to the new, you know what I mean? Like how many times have you seen a lecturer struggle to kind of, you know, work a Zoom or something like that? Like it's a very kind of, you know, it's a feature that happens, and with the changing times, people will get better with it. However, I think what technology could do and could bring to it, and something that I obviously wouldn't know how to even start, but it would be like working out whether we can use things like Apple Watches, whether we can use things like Fitbits and things like that to look and see whether there are any determinants that we can analyze, or any biomarkers that we can work out as well, whether they be by blood tests in like primary care settings and things like that, to determine whether you can halt disease and prevent it from actually becoming, deadly, especially for cancers and things like that, other things like neurodegenerative diseases, so Parkinson's disease, Alzheimer's disease. Like, we have an aging population, and working out how we can get them early on. And a lot of that would be with tech. So looking at behavioral data, looking at, for example, I know, like, if you look at like really long, like longitudinal studies, like the Framingham Heart study for cardiovascular disease, things like that, they were like long-term studies where you looked and analyzed biomarkers, different types of factors, different behavioral patterns, and then you were able to work out what was going to predispose people to cardiovascular disease. And that's why we, use statins. That's why we use, exercise and diet, and these are modifiable risk factors that we can target. I'm pretty sure the same thing can happen with other sorts of chronic diseases, cancer as well. And, it's about maintaining like bodily integrity from the get-go and stopping people from going there. And I think technology would be a really amazing thing that we could, really like just exploit, to be able to like work out what differences, we have in behavior that can lead us to certain paths. And I think that'd be a really interesting kind of field to kind of look at and see how it goes. I think especially for anything that's in terms of neurodegeneration, because we have no treatments for it, so it's better to kind of just stop it than let people get there.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, you bring up so many really good points there. I was actually scribbling them down as we go, because I just want to address so much of what you said. Absolutely. I think wearables are a way of bringing, it's empowering, hey, like it's bringing the practice of medicine into the hands of the people it's being practiced on. Like, you are now the both, I guess, the doctor and the patient in a certain regard. You're able to think about your own health prophylactically, and monitoring your own symptoms and monitoring your own parameters. And I'm sure that what those parameters are will change with time and will grow as we aggregate more data and learn more about what is driving this chronic disease epidemic that we're seeing in the world today. And I guess, but the flip side of that is we will have so much data. We already do have so much data, and so much personal data about not just someone's blood pressure and heart rate, but much more behavioral stuff, as you're saying, as well, and how we're interacting with each other, and it gets really personal. And I guess tech is another way. We're going to have, it's big questions that we're going to have to answer in the future, of how tech and data analysis and bioinformatics and how all of that, and ethicists, people working as ethicists, how these people are all going to work out what we're going to do with so much information, and how we're going to make sense of it in a really meaningful and productive way. Right, and to use it as prophylaxis rather than cure or treatment for something that's already happened. And speaking to your point earlier about the medical mindset, and why I find this so interesting, and I think I share your values quite a bit on how important it is to look at the driving factors of disease rather than just treating the symptoms or the complications of disease. It's just such an ingrained mindset in medicine about, it's ingrained in how we taught, and it's an old institution, medicine and the medical sciences. And I think it's based on a lot of tradition and a lot of traditional thinking in terms of, here is a patient who presents with this acute flare of a chronic condition, or an acute new onset acute condition. What are you going to do? How are you going to treat, excuse me, how are you going to treat the complications and the symptoms that they come up with? It's not, thinking about like lifestyle and diet and public health measures and the impact of, social factors like race and socioeconomic class on health, and also community and connection and things like that on health, is just not really brought up as something that we need to be thinking about.
Yeah, especially I think in terms of like mental health as well. I think that's something that's
Yeah.
ridiculous. Like, it's really important. And I think if anything, if we have a look at how like COVID has kind of like, if you look at how the pandemic has kind of hit and how our government has responded, it's very kind of reactive rather than proactive. And I think mental health, just like cardiovascular disease, just like diabetes, like in particular, when you look at the different types of risk factors, there are risk factors that we know for mental health, and there are early interventions that you can put in place, because once a person develops like, like ill mental health, for example, or any sort of kind of, any sort of kind of mental condition. Like, so I think with mental health in general, if you look at it, anxiety and depression, right, they're not longer as stigmatized as other types, right? But in general, there are definitely early interventions that you can put in place that prevent any sort of kind of, anywhere on that spectrum, you can kind of prevent it. But then once we get there, I think it's okay now in our society to have anxiety. It's kind of also okay to have depression, and people kind of throw it around as like a hip word, even like OCD. Like, there are so many times where people be like, oh, I have OCD, as kind of like a saying of, I'm a perfectionist, but they don't really have OCD, And I think breaking down that kind of like stigma in that kind of field is really important, but also putting in those risk factors initially, and early intervention initially, to therefore prevent that from happening in the first place. And especially the way our government's reacted to it, I think, we have such a horrible way of dealing with mental health that it's, it makes me really frustrated, but that's fine.
Yeah, and I guess as young people as well, it's not just the government and the reactive thinking of institutions, but I think it's on a very personal level, the reactive thinking of us as individuals, as young people. Like, I mean, I think thinking about diseases like diabetes and cardiovascular disease and strokes and all those really common killers in Western society and globally now, they seem to people like us as such far off. And even things like cancer, even working at a cancer institute.
Yeah, no, I know.
Abstract things that happen to people that are older, and people that are older are treated, and it's all just in the future. We don't think about it as 20-something-year-olds. And starting to think about, lifestyle changes and mental health, especially, things that we can do now, like right now as 20-year-olds, to kind of safeguard ourselves against all the, everything that you can imagine in the future. It's just like, why aren't we thinking about this now? Like, as young people.
It's a lot to take in, I think, as well. Like, you don't want to be sitting here and thinking about your own mortality either at 20. Like, I think everyone kind of lives with like this ignorance is bliss kind of perspective, where you're kind of sitting back and being like, that won't happen to me. Like, I'm special. That won't happen to me. But I think people, it's about, it's kind of scary. And I think the one kind of like good thing I think that's come out of this pandemic is the fact that everyone can be vulnerable to all sorts of things, and disease doesn't discriminate. Like, no matter, like, you can have all the money in the world and you can still get sick. I think it's really important.
I guess though, related back to the whole idea about funding in science research, it's now we've created this disparity between the things that are urgent and life-threatening in the more acute setting. So infectious diseases, and I guess like the more buzzwordy medical conditions such as cancer that gets a lot of funding. There are these things that we prioritize as a society. We funnel our funding and our energies into those areas, but it usually, as you said, because we have such limited resources, it comes at the cost of looking into mental health and chronic conditions and all those other things. And I guess I was just thinking, as you were talking about how the funding has changed, and and getting like 10 or 20 labs across the world to do the same thing with this COVID vaccine. It's this mentality of urgency and accelerating research and the scientific method, almost to the point of undermining the discipline and rigor and thought that needs to go into, and intentionality that needs to go into medical research. What do you think about that in terms of like
I completely agree with you. I think like when you look at it, I think in general, because I obviously come from like I completed master pharmacology. So like when I look back at it, and I remember a couple of lectures about like the process, so like how like the clinical trial process and how expensive it is to make a drug. And drugs are really expensive, right? And you forget that like especially because in Australia we have like the PBS, and we forget that, you know, some medications are actually really expensive, right? And we have the luxury of being able to be like, oh well, you know, medicine isn't that expensive, like I'd be able to afford it if I ever became sick, right? But you forget that some of them are actually really expensive. And the reason why they're really expensive is because pharmacology, it's a business, right? So like when you create a drug, you have to be able to like make up all the money that you spent on it, and it can be up to billions and billions of dollars trying to get a drug through clinical trials and everything, and getting them to the person. And then what happens when your target population or your target demographic is small, right? What happens when you have a disease where there's only 100 people in the world who have it, right? Ridiculously low incidence, but people still need that, right? And then at that point, it's kind of like, it's an ethical debate at that point. It's like, do we put in all the time and research to help 100 people, or do we direct funds somewhere else? And that sounds horrible, but it's like the reality of like, you know, resource allocation. Like that's what happens. Like you have a resource that is, you know, and you know that like research in a lab is very time consuming and people need to do it, right? So it, you know, it's a difficult decision. But I think also like when you look at the way that COVID's changed how science works, it's very kind of common for lots of science to be done, particularly science in universities. Universities are really great institutes for, you know, science, because there's a bit more of like what a typical researcher is in a university. You have like the capacity to like explore something, and if it's not working, you try alternate avenues and have a look at different ways of solving the problem. In lots of farm companies, from what like my friends have told me, is that they're very kind of like, this is the problem, and if it doesn't work, we move on, right? And they don't want to lose money, which is fair enough. They are a business, they need to be able to like make up for it. But I think it's really interesting how like COVID now in particular, a lot of it's being, you know, done through universities, because when you need something in an urgent way, you need to like not give up on it and look at different ways of solving something. So it's kind of really kind of cemented this fact that, you know, a university, and particularly through looking at things in different perspectives, has the capacity to achieve so much, particularly in research, which is then profitable after. I also think when you look at the pandemic and how it's impacted research, it's very political, which is something that science, you know, I wouldn't say it hasn't been prone to prior. I think politics has always played a role in, like, you know, in science, but I think never to this degree. So hydroxychloroquine, I think, is the perfect example, where it was you know, it was heavily impacted by certain politicians. And I think it's really important to kind of step back and say, like, you know, science needs to be done in a very unbiased way. And like you were saying, like, there's time, and you need to sit back and take a very methodological, I can't even speak today, approach to it, and kind of like sit down and be like, okay, well, these are the things that we need to do, this is the order that we do it in, and therefore we get there eventually. And like it takes time. I think people forget about that, like the amount of pressure that scientists have been placed under. And, you know, scientists, I think in general, aren't always, you know, appreciated enough, you know. I think like especially the people forget that, you know, they're the people who design the drugs, they're the people who will implement the drugs, they're the people who will work out what the you know, so essentially like what are the biomarkers that are causing this disease, and working out prophylactic ways to determine like how we can separate these like groups into treatment groups, and also how we can then treat these people before they get sick as well. And I think that's always like kind of forgotten. But I think the way that research is happening now, that's so political and it's so urgent, is like definitely perhaps to the detriment of you know, science.
Yeah, absolutely. And I like the idea that you bring up about how science is now so political. And you mentioned the word bias, and I just wanted to briefly touch on that, because I guess I mean, I don't have a research degree. I've never done my own lab research, or I've never had to sit down with a data set in front of me and think, okay, how am I going to present this data in a meaningful way, and how am I going to communicate this, you know, in a graph or a table, or, you know, that kind of thing. How easy is it? This is a very, I guess, basic question. So forgive me, but like, how easy is it really to sit down with a bunch of numbers and potentially manipulate them in a way that serves a particular agenda or bias? Because at the moment we're in an environment where we're looking to science to solve our problems, and it's considered a truth, like it's in the hierarchy of different truths, if there is such a thing, it's considered universally as something that is solid and factual and indisputable, and how does personal biases come into something that's so cold and hard as just numbers?
Yeah. I think this is all like comes down to, I think, like scientific integrity. Like you as a scientist have to have the integrity to be like, I'm not going to cheat the system, because, you know, we've seen what happens when we have people, particularly people who write papers about vaccination and misleading, you know, whole populations afterwards. And I think it's really important that you take away your own biases from any sort of science that you're doing and any sort of affiliation with any company that you have or anything like that. So it is really important, but it is easy to do it. So I think like, there are times as a scientist where you want something to work. Like you want, you know, you look at your theory and you're like, I want this to work. But sometimes things don't work. And I learned that in my honours year very quickly, because I was doing transval assays, and a lot of them are very kind of like, you have to look at them and you see how the cells migrate. And I remember having a discussion with my supervisor, and we were kind of along the lines of like, I'm like, I think I see a difference. And she's like, I see no difference. And it was just a matter of like, you know, you have to kind of stand back and not look at this data as if it's yours, and really understand that what you're doing here is for the best. Like, you know, that if you do your science well, and if you do it with integrity, without the need for you to be, you know, be amazing, I think that is really, really important for the field in general. And I think one of the things that's really difficult with science is the fact that we don't actually report things that don't work out well. And I think that's really important, because then you'll have people repeating science, and, you know, everyone wants that fancy Nature paper, or, you know, a fancy Cell paper where they can be like, I did this worked out well, this is a new theory, like a complete paradigm shift, right? But then you forget that people need to be guided, and this is all about feedback, right? So if you know that something's not working well, why would you, you know, not report it? Like, I feel like that to me is something that's like inherently flawed within the way that science works, but is something that I think we need to become as a society more accustomed to doing. So more accustomed to being like, okay, well, this didn't work, let's report it. And I remember it's something that like my supervisors really encouraged me to do in my honours, and there were definitely in my thesis parts of my experiment that didn't work out, and you just report them. And I think that's something that we should get into better practice in doing. And all research is valuable, even the ones that don't work out, because that shows you and guides you to the correct kind of way. So yeah,
absolutely. And it just adds to the pool of knowledge.
yeah, exactly.
It stops the accidental repetition and misuse of what is, as we have already said many times, limited resources. So yeah, absolutely. What do you think, what is it about positive results versus those negative results, or like null results, that makes that we are so drawn to? Like, what is inherently wrong with the way that we do science?
Yeah.
There is.
I think it's just like, yeah, I just think it's just the fact that, like, you know, human ego, I guess, like at some point you want to be able to be like, my theory was right. And I think with lots of scientists, it's like the fact that people who go into science and go into research and go into, you know, medicine, they're really driven about certain things. And I think a lot of it comes from problem solving. So you having the capacity to, you know, formulate a theory and then afterwards it being correct, or you proving it, is something that, you know, it's amazing. But then again, what's the truth? You know, like you could go into like the whole philosophical side of this and like go and like read up on Karl Popper and like work out, you know, what is a truth and what isn't a truth. And then you trying to like prove that your research is correct is also like, you know, so I think in general, I think science, the way that it needs to be done is like you formulate your own theory, and then afterwards you report whatever it is. And I feel like, you know, journals want to publish things that are cutting edge, new theories, new techniques, new like findings. And I think the problem is that when, you know, you look at it, science can be done in lots of different ways and you can be really innovative, but I think in general, like good science should be doing tests that are really simple sometimes, because sometimes the simple tests are ignored because people just want to like work out what's the fanciest way to do something, and then always reporting your findings, whether they be bad, whether they be good. And, you know, there's a lot of like emphasis on p-values now, and I think that's something that like lots of journals, and there's papers that have been published about, you know, how important is a p-value? Like, is it really that important? Like, it is an arbitrary value that we've placed on significance. It's not a, you know, it's definitely not.
Sorry to interrupt. Do you want to explain really briefly what a p-value is to people who might not know?
Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
A p-value is like basically, it's like a test of significance. So typically a p-value is less, if it's less than 0.05, it means that it is a statistically significant value. So your research is statistically significant. And people, because it's an arbitrary value, it can change. You can change what you think your p-value is and what is statistically significant. However, in general, most, it's just like a thing in science now where it's like a 0.05 is the cutoff, and that's what you're expecting.
Yeah.
And if it's just slightly over, so 0.055, some people take that as like a hard line, when in reality isn't. It could be, a problem with the study. It might not be, powered correctly. It could be just like you're testing the wrong parameter. There are so many different ways to look at it. And I think now, because everyone's become so infatuated with that, it's like creating these like hard lines in science where like if you're statistically significant, it's fine. But if you're just like the slightest bit off, it's just, do you disregard that research? Is that a good thing to do? So I think there are lots of papers on it, because some people, it depends what kind of group you are in science. Some people are very kind of strict in regard to that p-value and will stick to it, but others are more likely to kind of be like presenting their data even though it's insignificant. And we see that in a lot of journals, but typically a lot of the data will be focused on what is significant, not even like something that's just like, even if it's a trend, they'll report it, but they won't like, they'll be too scared to be like, this is what's happening.
Yeah, totally. I was just thinking as you were talking as well that just relating to what we were saying before about wearable technology and bringing medicine into the hands of the population, really. You work, or you've done your studies so far and your research so far in very, very specific, molecular pathways, genetic pathways. Tell me if I'm wrong and I'm kind of butchering it. But it seems like, and I read the title of your master's thesis, which was something to do with the very specific pathway of an atherosclerotic something.
Yeah, endothelin 1. Yeah.
What was the title before I offend you anymore?
It was it was endothelin 1 and the proatherogenic circulus vicious, which is like, and essentially it's like a novel prophylactic pro-inflammatory target for atherosclerosis, something along those lines. I can't remember my title. It was the last thing I wrote.
Yeah. So like how do you go about communicating such specific, molecular, hyper scientific data to people who are not in that field? Like, how do you make stuff that's hard to understand and stuff that's done to such detail accessible for people who would benefit from its knowledge?
Yeah, it's obviously really difficult because this type of science typically isn't built for the layperson. You're very rarely going to go into like so much detail about these different kind of, channels and proteins and things like that. But the best way to kind of do it is like, I remember having to explain to somebody like what I was studying, and this person had an arts degree and wasn't really like, scientifically minded. And also like, you have to remember, like, not everyone thinks this way. Like, I wouldn't be able to think in terms of like history or any sort of other kind of thing, but for me, this makes sense. So the way that I would have to picture is like, you just have to essentially, scrape all the fancy stuff, take all the fancy words out and be like, this is what it is. So I remember like when I was explaining, like I did an essay on like the glycocalyx in, which is like this layer above the endothelium, and it's kind of like a protective layer. And the way that I would just explain it's like
quickly, what's the endothelium? Let's just start there.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
Okay, so basically we have a blood vessel, and you can kind of think of it as a pipe, right? So you have a pipe, and basically in your blood vessels there's 3 different layers. And then the endothelium is kind of like the innermost layer, and it's in the so the whole of the pipe, so that's called the lumen. And basically a lot of my interest is about like, there's lots of papers as well that are going around about, vascular integrity. So like all the blood vessels in your system, they're really, really important, right? And maintaining vascular integrity is something that's extremely important for all sorts of chronic diseases, atherosclerosis, which is what I focused on, but cancers as well. And that's why I kind of picked this project, because I do have an interest in like oncology. I think that's really like, it's really important for me. I find it really interesting. And so basically above the endothelium, which is like the innermost layer, there's this kind of like slimy kind of layer, and that's like a protective layer, right? So that's what it is. So the way when you explain these things is you never go into the detail, because no one's going to understand it. There are words.
You just did it. That was perfect.
Yeah, I know, but not to the point where you're like managing. Like I remember like even on my honors thesis, I worked on two like proteins and a drug, right? Yeah. And I remember having to explain to somebody like what these proteins did, and they were asking me for the full like pathway, and I'm like, there are like there are hundreds of proteins that this protein interacts with. Like if you want me to sit down and have this conversation with you, I will, but you have to put aside 9 hours of your day. So like, you know, it's hard because it's hard to think of something at such a small level, because like our bodies are like, I remember like watching your first video when it was out, how you were talking about like the why medicine question, and like how you thought, you know, the universe and how it was so big. Like looking into a cell is insane. The amount of proteins, the amount, like the obviously like different types of cell, but the way that they function is just like absolutely extraordinary. And like having to explain how all these different proteins interact, and the fact that, so I remember with my protein, the reason why I picked it was ridiculously ambiguous. They have no idea how it works, how it's released from cells. It looks like it's released predominantly on one side of the cell in comparison to the other side of the cell. So how do you do these tests on this protein to work out on this, like for this protein to work out where its movements are? It's ridiculously challenging. And like, there's so much ambiguity with in regard to like how the scientific community views this protein and how it like all functions together. And it's just like, it's really interesting because like, you know, there's so much in this one protein that acts in different ways in different places, and it's expressed in different places, and it's like it's relatively recently discovered, like 30 years ago, for a protein that's like, you know, that's pretty like novel, you know, and then particularly because it has such an important role in the body. So yeah, it's really interesting. But I think when you look at all these things, like there's so much detail that you wouldn't want to explain that to somebody. Someone would look at that and be like, nope, that's it. I'm out.
Yeah, absolutely. Look, Ivona, we don't have too much time left because I'm worried about this going on for too long, and I'm not going to be able to upload this video at all. But I did really want to ask you, this is a bit of a 180, but I wanted to ask you, so, okay, all in all, you are a very high achiever. You have done a lot in academia, and you're also very competent in basketball and your sports. And I am wondering, well, I'm wondering two things. Firstly is, what is your relationship with success? I know that's a bit of a big question to end with, but
yeah,
how do you see it play out in your life, and has it, you know, what's been the driving factors for you?
I think like, okay, so obviously coming from like my parents were immigrants here, I think like I've obviously seen how much, and they really value education. My mum was a biochemist and she's like moved into the business world. My dad's an engineer, and they really value science. So for me, it was always like, you know, a university degree wasn't something that I thought was optional. I thought it was something that I had to do. And lucky enough, I actually really like learning. So it worked out well for me. But it was something that, you know, it was something that I would do. The way that I kind of view success, I think it's really different, because what I've kind of realized is that when I've achieved certain things in my life, it's only for me, it's not for other people. And I think that's what's important. It's about setting goals for me and making sure I'm really happy with them. Initially, I had a hard time kind of deciding what I was going to do in like certain parts of like my life. Like I was kind of like stuck, and sometimes there are people that follow the crowd. So typically, you know, you finish biomed and there are certain pathways that people follow. They would either do a PhD or an MD. And although I could have gone straight into a PhD, I wanted to explore and do something that was really interesting for me and something that I really wanted to do. So I think when I look at success, it's like guided by like, firstly, what I'm passionate about, what I want to study, what I want to do. And then also, have I committed the most to that? So it's about working hard and making sure that, you know, you've left everything you can on the plate. If it works out well, it does. But then I think if it doesn't, I think you're still successful because you've put everything in and you've tried everything that you could possibly do to, you know, do well in this like certain endeavor. And then afterwards, I think if it doesn't work out well, I think that's a success in itself, because some of my greatest kind of like successes in my eyes have come from failures initially. So I think that's something that's really important to kind of understand. But yeah, was that the question, or did you just ask one of them?
Oh no, that was one of them.
Yeah,
that's really good answer. Thank you. I feel like I'm just ready to
go
now. So, and the other one was, so you have obviously had moments, you know, in whether it's with like your basketball or sitting for an interview or doing presentations, because I know that in research world, in research land, you do a lot of presentations. How do you get into that mindset, and how do you prepare yourself for something that is, you know, get into the zone, I guess, to use that word, like to get into the zone and to feel calm and present, and like you're being very authentic in a time that is stressful?
Yeah. So I think for me, that was so I'll give you, for example, like my interview for Oxford. That was the first one that I had to do where I was actually genuinely really nervous. I think when I'm presenting, I think what kind of calms me down is the fact that I actually know my work really well. And when you have the confidence in your knowledge and like you knowing that you can answer these questions, I think the rest of it comes really easily. It's about, you know, knowing that you know, like that you know, know your work and you can present it then in the like with the safety behind the fact that you know everything. With my interview, that was really nerve-wracking. When I did that interview, I remember going downstairs because it was over the phone. I remember going downstairs and telling my parents that I was like, I don't think I got it. Like I was, because obviously like you get your interview first, but not everyone gets selected for an interview. So it's quite like a lengthy process. And then I remember going downstairs being like, I did not like it. But it was over the phone and it was really difficult because it was actually like an academic conversation where you sat down and you had to kind of debate something. And, you know, it was initially that. And then afterwards, I had to solve a couple of like chemistry questions. There were a couple of like maths questions they made me solve, which is over the phone, which was really nerve wracking. And, you know, I got those right. But the academic debate was kind of like concerning because I remember he actually lectured me afterwards. So there was two people on the phone call, and I think there might have been others listening, I'm not sure, but two people that were talking to me was our coordinator for our subject and a lecturer who I really respected, who actually lectured me afterwards. And I remember as soon as I picked up the call, it kind of got into this debate, and then they had, you know, they read on my resume because it's like a massive, you have to put in a personal statement, you have to have three people like so 3 supervisors endorsing you, that kind of thing. And they were going through and they're like, oh, you did research on this, and they were quizzing me about my research, and some of it like had escaped me for a second. Like even though I knew it, it was just the fact that I was under a lot of pressure, and then they kept asking me questions, and they were asking me about like you know, what I thought about this particular type of like pharmacology, like where it would take me. But it was kind of like a debate, and I had never had something like that before. And I think what honestly I think got me through was the fact that I stayed really calm. And the fact that like I was talking to them, and like although I was inside stressing, it was the fact that like when I was talking to them I was relatively calm, hopefully. But yeah, I think the best thing to do is like be confident in yourself and your abilities, particularly if it's your research and you're presenting something. You know that more than any other person in that, you know, if your professor or your supervisor is watching, they probably know it better than you, but like more than any other person in that lecture theatre or whatever. So it's important that, you know, you just back yourself.
Yeah, wow. Okay, that's a good note to end on.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's hard.
So
I mean, there's no one's going to be your biggest cheerleader other than yourself. And if you're there and kind of like nervous and you don't think that you know it, it's going to come across that way. But like no one knows your project better than you do, particularly like your honors and your masters. Like you're going to know that better than anybody else. You're going to know it inside and out, other than perhaps your supervisor who's watching over you, who's had like 20, 30 years experience. There's no one else there that focuses on such a niche field. Like science is so niche. Like no one else was working on my 2 proteins, you know, so it's not like I was gonna,
yeah,
they were gonna be surprised by anything I was gonna say. I could have been selling them something completely incorrect and they'd have no idea. Like, I think that's what people need to kind of also understand. Like there are, like with that being said, that's also not the case at Peter Mac. Peter Mac, there's lots of really, really smart people there who know a lot of things and go to a lot of seminars and are really, really informed. But I think in general, when you're, you know, practicing and giving a speech, a lot of the crowd don't understand your concept as well as you do. So I think that's just really important.
Yeah, and I guess you're also the expert in yourself, and backing yourself is, I mean, backing myself, I think has been something that I've had to learn or like relearn, I guess. And yeah, being confident in who you are and what you bring to the table as well. Like not just necessarily the content and, you know, what you're specifically talking about, because that can be very, very varied. And we're not always talking about E6AP inhibition or whatever it was.
Yeah.
But, you know, like having that groundwork there and that really foundational feeling centered in your identity, I guess. And for you, it sounds like that is linked to your knowledge and how you think and what you know. And for others it could be something else, but yeah, that definitely speaks true for a lot of people.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Yeah, no. Well, that's a really good point to end on, and thank you so much for talking to me.
No, thank you for having me.
Yeah, it's been
I'm so proud of you. I love this channel. I think it's really important, especially for women, to make sure that they know what there is in STEM.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you so much. Yeah, it's this conversation's been so insightful, and I think I've learned a lot. So hopefully other people do, and hopefully I can actually upload this video because it's going to be a big one.
Yeah, let me know how you go.
Yeah, I will. Okay, I'm gonna stop recording. So
Okay,
goodbye.
Let me just. Did you stop recording?
Not yet.